to you.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you once again for inviting me back to do another webinar with CCSN. It's really my pleasure. So here's an overview of what we're going to speak about today. And these slides are meant to provide you with the core concepts of advocacy, a general sort of overview. And it's what I typically provide to all the patient groups, patients, caregivers, physicians, and other healthcare professionals I engage to do advocacy. And while I'll be concentrating my comments on advocating to government, the concepts that I'll be discussing today work equally as well whether you're advocating to your MP, to your spouse's physician, or your child's teacher. The principles are the same. I teach advocacy really as a life skill, as something that we should all be able to do under any array of circumstances that we may come across. And then finally, just before we start, you should also know that, well, again, we'll be concentrating on advocating to government as what we call our target. This is not meant to be a cynical look at government, but rather a snapshot of the reality, certainly that I experienced when I worked there some years ago, particularly from the political side. So let's start at the beginning. What is advocacy? Well, it's verbal support or argument for a cause or a policy. That's a dictionary definition that I'm not terribly fond of. So I've come up with another definition that I think is that's a little bit easier to sort of conceptualize. It's telling your story to someone, and again, in this case, we're going to really talk about that someone being government, through various means with the express purpose of compelling them to do, or in some cases, not to do something. In a more simpler form, that is really what advocacy is. It is a process. This is the first really important point I want to make. It is a process that almost always takes time to realize tangible results. It is not, for example, what protesters do when they chain themselves to a tree to prevent it from being cut down, meaning that it's not radicalism, it's not activism, it's advocacy. I'm not casting any dispersions on those other two activities. I'm just saying that's not what advocacy is in the approach that we typically take. It's very reasonable. It's grounded in sound, reasonable, rational thought or argument. There is no one way to do it. It's very personal to your own style and your own comfort level. You don't need to be a certain kind of person to be an effective advocate. You just need to know how to do it. And of course, it's your choice as to how much or how little you may want to do. And then finally on this slide, it's really about empowerment. It's exerting some form of control and initiating some form of action around an issue that matters to you. And maybe more than anything, that's really the important part of advocacy. So why is advocacy important? Well, if you remember nothing else, you simply need to remember this, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's life, I think it's fair to say. It's certainly politics, it's certainly government, it's certainly any large institutional or bureaucratic setting that you may have found yourself in. The squeaky wheel clearly gets the grease. It's also important because if I work in government and an issue comes across my desk that affects your organization and I don't know you exist, then for all intents and purposes, at least in my world, you don't exist. And if you don't exist, then I'll never reach out and call you in any sort of context. So it's really about getting yourself known to decision makers, and we'll talk more about relationships in a moment. It's also important because, again, if I work in government, and this is not exaggeration, I have 100 files on my desk, I can tell you exactly the top 3 files. I don't need to know the issue. I don't need to know the ministry. I don't need to know anything. I can tell you exactly what those issues, what's going on with those 3 files. And that is that people are making noise. People are engaged in the process. People are demanding that the government do something and make some change. That's why they're on the top of the pile. The file on the bottom, file number 100, again, it doesn't matter what the ministry is. I can tell you why it's there. It's there because it appears that absolutely nobody cares if anybody picks it up. And in the context of the work that governments typically do, I can tell you they never pick up file number 100. Never, ever will they pick up file number 100. So the idea here, and why I'm sharing this analogy with you, is because what you're trying to really do is to get up higher and higher and higher on pile, if you will, this visual pile of 100 files, to the top 3, to the top 5, in order to have government pick it up and actually deal with whatever your issue is. And then again on this, slide, it's important, I think, to remember, because if you do nothing, nothing will change. But if you do something, something may just change. So the prospect of advocacy and engagement is very, very simple. My job is not to compel people to do advocacy. My job is to simply say, look, if you want to do something, you have a chance to make a change around your issues. But if you've decided you don't want to do anything, I will tell you nothing will change. Nothing will change if nobody does anything. Why is patient advocacy important? And just a note here before I go on, when I use the term patient, I use it in a holistic manner. I refer here to caregivers, I refer to survivors and families and loved ones and anybody else who has a connection to the person who is directly, for example, impacted by an issue. So the short answer is because they vote, because we all vote, because it's healthcare. And in a provincial context in particular, healthcare is one of the 2 primary issues, education being the other one, that governments at the provincial level have a very, very heightened concern about, shall we say, politically, as well as from a governing perspective, or the party that's currently governing. So politicians know healthcare is important. We all know healthcare is important. And so patients who are at the center of healthcare have tremendous amounts of power if they use it properly, if they use it effectively, and if they can really get decision makers focused on what it is they want to do. And I don't think it's any exaggeration, again, because we're talking about healthcare as opposed to another sector like forestry or fishing or mining or something like that. People, voters, actually make decisions about who to cast their ballots for based on healthcare concerns. And again, my point is politicians know that, and so they're cognizant of that reality. Different kinds of advocacy. For people new to the world of advocacy, it's often personal need that will compel one to take action. In fact, it's almost always personal need. You're not looking to change the world, you just want to help yourself or a loved one. But it's out of this personal need that some people will start to realize they have an opportunity to bring about larger public policy change by advocating for broadly based issues. And the people that do that, I describe them as having graduated. The scenario is actually quite simple. You enter into the healthcare system as a patient, as a caregiver, as a loved one, whatever it is. And at some point, that entry, that entree into the healthcare system will result in some kind of a finality. It will end, whether it ends within the day or it takes years or whatever it is. There will be an end point to all of this. And during your time in the healthcare system, you may have different experiences. They can be good and they can be bad and positive and negative and whatever they may be. Now, what most people do is when they enter into the healthcare system, they really just seek to resolve their issue, whatever it may be, and then essentially go home, again, whether it's at the end of that day or the end of the week or whenever it is. But some people who enter the healthcare system in particular, who find challenges within that system, will think to themselves, well, wait a minute, if I'm having a problem, or if my family's having a problem here, or if our patient association is having a problem here, then others must be having a problem as well. And if we could solve the larger problem, then it would help more people and not just the immediate need that we have, again, as a family or as an individual. Those people have graduated. They graduate from seeing the world beyond just themselves to something bigger. Now, most people will never graduate. And again, that's fine. That's not the issue. My point in sharing this with you is because in my experience, both in government and outside of government, is that for those people who do graduate and who do start to position their issue within a larger context, I've not only seen them change health policy in this country, I've seen them make health policy, as in make it from scratch. Where there was nothing, there is now something, because one person or a small group of people decided to see the world beyond themselves. And that's critically important in our system, to have people like that. The essence of good advocacy, this is the foundation. If any one of these elements is missing, you're going to have a difficult time starting to engage, let alone get better at it. I'm going to touch on some of the elements in this on this slide, not all of them to the full extent. I should have mentioned up front that the full version of this presentation is about 2 hours, and so you're getting a robust version of it, but you're not getting the depth, for example, that I might give in other circumstances. But this is a quick overview of the essential pieces. So there are 2 cornerstones to effective advocacy: the ability to prepare and share your personal story, and building and sustaining relationships with key decision makers. So I'll say this for the first time: nobody can tell your story as well as you can. In the context of the work that I do, I can train people how to develop strategies, and I can help to implement those strategies, but I can never tell your story. Nobody can ever tell your story as effectively as you can. The absolute key to advocacy is the personal story. Now, let me just differentiate this a little bit for clarity's sake. When I talk about telling your personal story, I'm talking about individuals who are directly impacted by the issue. So in the case of healthcare, again, we're talking about patients, caregivers, families, loved ones, those kinds of things. When we talk about healthcare professionals, we talk about sharing their personal experience. We don't use the word story, we use the word experience. Because what healthcare professionals tend to do is they tend to talk about either an individual case that they may have had to demonstrate some larger challenge or issue, or they do sort of a blended amalgamation of all of their experience into one sort of catch-all story. That's also the same with patient organizations as well. Unless you're an individual within an organization who has a direct connection to the disease, what you're likely sharing is your personal experience in having engaged with individuals who are directly impacted, kind of thing. And so the reason why personal stories are so important is because it's really the key. It's really the key to connecting with the decision maker as a human being. And what I mean by that is, certainly when I worked in government, and I didn't realize this until after I left, but when a stakeholder came to see me, my default position, and I don't think I'm alone on this, was to actually try to stay disconnected from the person, not connected to the person. Because if I was disconnected to the person, then I was less likely to want to do something in terms of helping them with their issue. But when you feel connected to somebody, then you feel more compelled to want to actually engage on their behalf or with them. The personal story is the best mechanism that we all have, or personal experience, to draw the decision maker in, to draw the person in to whom we're advocating, to make a connection on a very human level, and in essence, I'll put it this way, to make them care. Now, the objective of advocacy is not to make somebody care. I want to be clear about that. But if you can connect to somebody and they care about what you're telling them, then you have a much higher probability that they'll actually do something around your issue. And that's the whole point. It's a means to an end, to be perfectly frank about that. Finding others who know your issue before deciding how to tackle a particular issue. Has anyone else ever done so in your province or in the country or elsewhere in the world that you can learn from? So this is really a business about beg, borrowing, and stealing from other people who have done this in the past. It is highly unlikely that any of us will ever face an issue in healthcare that no other human being has ever faced in the history of time. There will be some uniqueness to your circumstances, and that's fair. But I can assure you, in every case, somebody will have faced something differently, and maybe there's something out there that they did that you can find out about that can help you resolve your own issue. In general, you're limited only by your resources, which is no small challenge, certainly for many organizations and that kind of thing, and your imaginations. So the analogy that I often give is that, for example, it's not like our legal system where there are rules of evidence and rules of procedure. When you go into a courtroom, whether you go in as a lawyer or you go in as a self-represented litigant, you are required to follow what are called rules of procedure and rules of evidence. They're textbooks. In Ontario, for example, they look like textbooks. If you do not follow those rules of evidence and procedure, you will be politely or impolitely asked to leave the courtroom, because that's the way our legal system is set up. That's how it functions. But out here in the real world, or as I call it, the normal world, there are no rules of evidence or procedure. There is nobody standing over you saying, you can't do that way. You're not allowed to do what you want to do that particular way. There's obviously common sense. There are obviously legal boundaries. There's social norms and all that sort of stuff. I'm not talking about that. But what I'm talking about is using your imaginations to say, is there a way that we can do this? Is there a way that we can get information out and advocate for whatever it is that, whatever the change is that we're looking for, without having the restrictions, for example, that you have in our legal system? I mentioned that it often takes time, or really always takes time, to realize tangible results through advocacy, at least any large advocacy effort. And that's because relationships are so important to the process. And it takes time to build good, solid relationships with people of influence. So this brings us to the second cornerstone piece of advocacy, which is having relationships. But if you cast the net widely enough, I would suggest to you that someone will know someone who knows the decision maker that you need to get to. The truth is that we live in a very small country, population-wise, as you know, but we also live in a country in which power is extremely concentrated. We don't have the same division of powers as they do in the United States. There's a tremendous concentration of power in the hands of very few people, quite frankly, at the provincial and the federal level. And so what I'm suggesting to you is, because of the small size of the population of Canada, because of the concentration of political power under our system, you are really not all that far from the decision makers. It's not 6 degrees of separation, and in a lot of cases, it might only be 2 degrees of separation in terms of how close you may be to these people. But it can be a real challenge for a number of reasons, not the least of which is, whenever you're interacting with politicians every 4 years, there can often be a change. In fact, often there can be a wholesale change. And so you build relationships with people on the political side, for example, elected representatives. And then an election comes along, and all of a sudden, all of these people, or many of these people that you built relationships with, are no longer in those same positions. That can be very frustrating. I don't have an answer for you. I don't have a magic way to not be subject to that reality. It just kind of is what it is. But it doesn't preclude you from having to build relationships. So using Ontario as an example, as we go into an election next month, after that election, you will have, just because of the sheer number of people who aren't running again, irrespective of what the outcome is, you're going to have a lot of new MPPs. It is worth starting to build relationships with those people right after the election, because you know that they are going to be around for 4 years, presumably, notwithstanding a minority government, but in all likelihood, but they as individuals have been elected for the next term. Bureaucrats don't tend to change as much as politicians do, but they still do shuffle around somewhat. Again, it doesn't preclude you from building relationships with people. You have to build those relationships, because if you don't, and then you need somebody from them and you just show up and say, I need you to help me, they may not say this to you, but what they will think to themselves, quite frankly, is, who are you? Where have you been? Why am I just hearing from you now? Why are you showing up only when you want something from me? And where were you in the context of building a relationship up until this moment? But it takes tremendous patience. It takes being at the right tables with the right people and staying engaged. And more than anything, and you'll hear me say this again before the end of this presentation, it's about not getting discouraged and not giving up. But the truth is, for those of you who haven't done this before, for those of you who haven't engaged in advocacy with government specifically before, you may feel, if you try to do this, that you really don't belong, that you're really not supposed to be here, that you really don't know what's going on, and so why are you even trying? I will tell you that that feeling is set up by design. You're not supposed to feel comfortable. You're not supposed to feel like you know what you're doing. And quite frankly, you're supposed to kind of just give up and go home. It's a lot easier to do that. And so what I'm suggesting to you is, if you know that it's by design you're supposed to feel uncomfortable, then I'm suggesting to you that you simply embrace it and move on. And don't worry about it. Just hang in there. Just stay in there. Because the alternative, as I mentioned before, is very clear. If you stop, it's over. But if you stay, you have a chance of being successful. And by the way, a lot of people will go home. Most people will go home. And if you're the only one left standing, as I like to say, then they'll have to deal with you sooner rather than later. They'll have to deal with you at some point if you're literally the only person left. So it's not easy to do. It's very easy to say. It's not easy to do. But don't let discomfort, don't let the feeling of being a fish out of water discourage you from hanging in there. When you have no relationships, don't miss a chance to communicate and don't stop communicating. The most effective people in advocacy never stop talking about their issue. They will take the opportunity to tell anybody that they come across, anybody that they're engaged with, that this is their issue, this is what's important to them. Because the truth is, you never know who you're sitting next to. You never know who you're standing next to, depending on the circumstances. And oftentimes, you may find somebody who has some kind of a connection directly or indirectly to your issue, and you never know because they may be able to help you. So just keep talking about it and just keep going with it, and that's the best chance that you have. Okay, we're switching gears now. This is the process, the three-step process that one can start to do right away to create an actual advocacy strategy that you can then implement in support of your issues. It's very practical, so we're sort of finished with the theory of advocacy, our two cornerstone pieces of your personal story and relationships. And it doesn't require substantial resources. But it does require three things that I think is important to mention to you and to highlight. Number one, this takes time, which I know is a challenge for everybody. But it takes time to realize tangible change. You can't change the world by devoting 5 minutes a year to your cause. It won't work. Now, again, I can't tell you how much time because it depends on the circumstances, but it does take time to make change. And large change can take a lot of time to do. And I say that not to scare you off from doing it, but just because it's a reality that I think it's important to understand. Number two, it takes a commitment. A commitment is a conversation that you either have with yourself in your own head where you say, look, I'm committed to making this change. I'm not going to stop until it's done. Or a conversation that a group of you would have where you say, look, collectively, we are committed to making this change and we are not going to stop until it's done. Now, the only caveat to that, of course, is that in healthcare, because you're dealing with people who are sick sometimes and who cannot do this all the time and sometimes have to take a break and focus on their health, that's an important thing to recognize. So I don't want you to think that what I'm suggesting is that this is a commitment, and unless you can make a 100% commitment, you should make no commitment. On the contrary, the idea is that collectively as a group, and it doesn't have to be a large group, you collectively say, we are going to just keep going. There will be times when some of us cannot participate. There will be times when more of us will join. But to some degree, to some extent, at all times, we will keep moving forward as opposed to stopping, in which case, again, as I've said, it's over. There's really nothing more to do once you stop trying to advocate. And then finally, a willingness to start and stick with it. Starting's easy. We as people are very easy at starting all kinds of different things. That's not terribly challenging. It's the sticking with it, as I alluded to a moment ago. Again, it's getting up every day and doing this work day in and day out, week in and week out, certainly month in and month out, and sometimes for years, when you may not even have a sense as to whether anybody's listening, anybody's going to respond, or whatever it may be. I'm not suggesting that along the way you're not going to have milestones and checkpoints and that you're just going to go and go and go without any idea what's happening. But there will be stretches in any advocacy campaign, certainly of some duration, in which you won't know necessarily whether you're getting any traction. And then one day, seemingly out of the blue, but it's not really out of the blue because you've been doing the work, something will happen, something will change. And all of a sudden you'll go up to a next level, or you'll be that much closer to whatever your objective is. So you just have to hang in there. You just have to stick with it, as I mentioned. Okay, 3 steps. Here's the first step, key message development. Politicians as a group tend to know a little bit about a number of different things. That's not a criticism, it's just an accurate reflection of their jobs. And they're required to deal with many different issues every day. This requires you, as an advocate, to simplify as much as possible the issues that you put before them. But I'm not talking about dumbing it down. I'm talking about conveying the core elements in a compact manner, the core elements of what they need to know in a very, very compact manner. That's what you're trying to do here. Your 3 key messages should tell a self-contained story. We talk about 3 key messages being 25 words or less. So 75 words or less. I will tell you, the people that do this at the very, very highest level, it's not 25 words or less, it's 10 words or less, or as few as, well, not less, it's as few as 10 words, I should say. Absolutely elite advocates can convey 3 key messages in 30 words. It's remarkable, but it can be done. I say take 25 words per key message for a total of 75. You'll notice the slide says they must be clear, compelling, concise, and consistent. All 4 of those words, we call them the 4 C's. Those are particularly important. If you can stay focused on the 4 C's, if you can design your 3 key messages and you can test them for clarity, whether they're compelling, concise, and consistent, then you've got the key messages that you need. They'll also be unique to your issues and to your circumstances. When I'm designing key messages, I use something called the 14-year-old boy test. It's called the 14-year-old boy test because it doesn't work with girls. They're too smart. You have to have a boy. We have 3 boys, so I know what I'm talking about. In fact, our youngest one is about to turn 14, so this is absolutely perfect timing to have this discussion. If you can deliver your 3 key messages, I don't care what the issue is, I don't care how complicated it is, it doesn't matter. If you can deliver your 3 key messages to a 14-year-old boy, and he has some clue what you're talking about, you have conveyed the core elements in a compact manner, as I mentioned previously. But if he has no clue what you just said, he is absolutely lost, then you have not conveyed the core elements in a compact manner. My point is, that's the level at which you need to come in with your key messages. It is your responsibility to come, if you will, down to the level of comprehension of the listener or the person to whom you're advocating, and not expect them to come up to your level of comprehension and understanding around the issue. That's why, again, we call it the 14-year-old boy test. So in the context of key messages, this next slide is something that up until a couple of years ago I didn't include in my presentations, but I kept being asked, give us a model. What is an example of what we would talk about in terms of key messages? And so this is the one that I've designed. This is not the model, it is simply a model. Not all key messages need to follow this model, but I think this is one that is pretty typical and pretty useful in what I'll call most circumstances. Your first key message probably should say something about the issue, the challenge, the problem, or whatever it is. And I use the word problem because, quite frankly, if it wasn't a problem, if it wasn't a concern, then you wouldn't be here. Let's face it. You don't design key messages unless it's a thank you campaign. You don't design key messages to say, hi, everything's great. I just thought that I'd advocate to you to tell you that everything was great. It doesn't make any sense. So the first key message is really meant to encapsulate what is the problem, what is the issue, what is the challenge, what is the concern. The second key message should convey, or you should consider having it convey, what is the impact of the problem? Now, this is important because a lot of people think that if they simply go to a decision maker and say, I have a problem, here it is, that the decision maker will automatically just say, oh my goodness, wow, that's a problem, we'll have to fix it. That's not the way it works. Because you have a problem is just the first step. You need to be able to articulate and to demonstrate the impact of the problem. And as I'm sure you can anticipate, it isn't just the impact on you, it has to be also the impact on them, ideally. Now, it may or may not work out that way. We'll talk about that a bit in a moment. But certainly you have to talk about how the issue impacts you directly, your family, like we talked about. But if there's a way to also at least infer that the problem may have an impact on them, the person to whom you're advocating, that's a really solid second key message. And then finally, what would it look like if we solved or didn't solve the problem? And usually we try to stay on the positive side, which is, what would it look like if we solve the problem? Key messages that end with, and if you don't do something, the sky's going to fall, doesn't usually resonate with government. It's usually much better to say, and if we do something, then this is how things could get better. And that final key message really needs to be focused on the decision maker. What would it look like if we solve the problem? How would things be better, particularly for them? This is a really, really important piece in all of this, okay? So what is the problem? What is the impact of the problem? What would it look like if we solve the problem? And then that third key message is the bridge over to what we call your ask, which is what I'll get to in just a moment. When to advocate? Timing is everything in life, and it is absolutely timing is everything when it comes to advocacy. There's a few things for consideration here on this slide, and I'll speak to a couple of them very briefly. The second bullet, take advantage of the newly elected. So again, using Ontario as an example, or Quebec later on this year, or Alberta next year, you're going to have an election. There will be newly elected people. And being able to get in to see them quickly and to have them understand your issue and potentially do something or run with your issue is what we talk about when we say take advantage. It may not be the nicest way to say it, but to take advantage of newly elected people. Strike while the issue is hot. That really has to do with timeliness. So you can be going along in an advocacy campaign and you may or may not have some measure of traction. And then all of a sudden something hits the newspaper, something hits the news, maybe from around, somewhere else halfway around the world, but it connects to your issue. That's what we talk about. You jump on an issue that's hot or a related element to your issue that's hot, and you ride that wave, as it were, because of that. And then the last one, know when to do nothing. That's a tough one for a lot of people, but there are moments in an advocacy campaign, again, particularly an extended advocacy campaign, where it may be time to just pause. It's actually not do nothing. It's more like pausing, because you're not doing nothing in the sense that you're going home, but you're simply pausing for a moment. You could be pausing because, again, something has happened in the environment that should cause you to pause. You could be pausing, for example, because there's an election. An election is often a time, at least for a moment, to take a bit of a pause, depending on what the outcome is. But also the time before and after an election can also be very busy. It depends on the circumstances. But this idea that it isn't just a constant din of noise or activity. It ebbs and flows. There'll be times when it's louder, times when it's quieter, times when you may actually pause, and times when you're going full out. And that's really what we mean by that piece. Second step are your advocacy tools. This is the means of delivering your key messages after you've designed those 3 key messages. And it really represents the core of any effective advocacy strategy. Anything that you have or produce that may be used to communicate with people is a potential tool. And I know that's rather a vague statement, but it includes things like face-to-face meetings, letters, websites, petitions, and you'll see on the next couple of slides, I won't speak to them in any detail, but you'll see in the next couple of slides, I've given you a partial list of the kinds of tools that we typically use. Now, I told you that advocacy was a process. I want to just break that down a little bit more with those 3 words: educate, demonstrate, advocate. The first thing you need to do if you're going to advocate to anybody about anything is you need to educate them about your issue, and you do that by delivering your 3 key messages we just talked about. And by the way, it doesn't mean that you only deliver your 3 key messages. We talk about having supporting points and fact sheets and other information that you can use to buttress or to support your 3 key messages. But your 3 key messages always have to be at the heart of what it is that you are communicating or educating around. The second thing you need to do is to demonstrate why your issue is important to you. Now, we talked a little bit about this, but I want to reiterate this. Again, demonstrating is not so much demonstrating why your issue is important to you, but it's demonstrating why your issue must or should be important to them, meaning the person to whom you're advocating. It's really all about them. quite frankly, certainly in the context of government and in the dynamic of advocacy. And again, this is a concept that I think some people will often push back against, but I do believe it's true. In the dynamic of advocacy, when you have, in the case of healthcare, you've got patients and caregivers and all of these interests in the public and all of that kind of stuff and decision makers, the most important person in that dynamic, quite frankly, is not the patient. It's not you. It's not your loved ones. It's the decision maker. Why? Because they have what you need. Now, I'm not talking about being deferential or subservient to the decision maker. That's not my point here. My point here is that if you and I are involved in a dynamic in which I need something from you, I am going to ensure that in the context of that dynamic, you believe that you are the most important person in that relationship. That's what I'm talking about. And if you're not the most important person, then I shouldn't be engaging you, and that's the whole point. So demonstrating why it's important to the decision maker that they take action and framing it in a way that speaks to them in their language, their interests, is really what this is all about. It's about positioning your issue, putting it forward, making it clear that it's important to you, and then almost backing off in a way that you make it clear that there's also a vested interest in it for them, and then shifting and focusing the attention on the decision maker and almost taking a bit of a backseat. Of course, you're still reaching your objective, which is to help yourself or a loved one, but you're positioning it in a way that is more appealing or palatable to the decision maker. And then finally, advocate. Your one ask, which we'll get to right now. Educate, demonstrate, advocate. 3 steps. You can't skip a step. You can't do them out of order. This is how they fall. So here's 2 slides about advocacy tools. Again, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail. We do utilize all of these advocacy tools. Many organizations utilize some or all of these advocacy tools. You'll note, of course, that you've got social networking, social media, that kind of thing, which is also critically important. But I also draw your attention to e-advocacy, which has been around for a long time. E-advocacy's been around for at least 15 years, if not longer. But it's now becoming more and more critical, certainly from anybody who wants to do a grassroots advocacy campaign, to consider having an e-advocacy component, and this is the most important thing, to have your e-advocacy completely aligned with or really intertwined with all of your other social media, traditional media, and whatever it may be. And all of your advocacy tools should be blended together for one seamless offering, if you will, to your supporters and one seamless voice to decision makers. So just a couple more slides, but we are at sort of the final one in terms of the 3 steps, which is your one ask. The whole objective or goal of an advocacy strategy is to get to this moment, to get to this slide, to get to this place, because you're going to ask for the one thing you need and not a list of what you want. And I'll say that again, because those words have all been chosen very carefully, because you're going to ask for the one thing that you need and not a list of what you want. Advocacy is not Christmas. It's not an opportunity to ask for everything you've ever wanted from a decision maker, especially when you're advocating to government. If you ask for everything, you will get nothing. You need to stay focused on that one thing you need. Now, you may need more than one thing. You may need 5 things. You may need 5 things critically. I don't argue with that. But what I do suggest is that as you go forward, you focus on one of those 5 things, resolve it, and then come back and focus on the second one. The way we describe it is this: it's one ask per target. It's one ask per target. And let me break that down a little bit, because I want to be clear about this. If you had an issue that involved the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, and you had another issue, a separate issue, that involved the Ministry of Education, you can run 2 simultaneous campaigns because your targets are different. Now, I know it's one government, one provincial government, but your targets, meaning, and the definition of a target is the person who can affect the change that you require, who can do what you need. You have two separate, distinct targets. So fine, if you have the resources and you have the capacity, you want to run a campaign aimed at the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, and one aimed at education, you can do that. But you can't run two campaigns aimed at the Ministry of Health in New Brunswick or any other province. That's one too many asks. One ask per target, just to be very clear about this. So again, this is a case where less is definitely more. The final thing on this slide, and this is absolutely critically important, your ask needs to be tangible. It needs to be a thing. Okay, this is not an ask. Government, we need your support. Support's not a thing. You can't bring me a plate of support or a cup of help. They're not things. In fact, I would suggest to you that the words that politicians use to make a living, hope, support, commitment, help, are really the enemies of advocacy because they don't mean anything. They're intangible words. This is an ask. For example, to your MPP or to your MLA, I need you to write a letter to the Minister of Health, and I need you to say the following three things in that letter. That is an ask because it's a thing. It's a letter. You can see it. You can feel it. It's there. Now, I'm not suggesting that having an MPP write a letter is going to solve all your problems. That's not the point. I'm distinguishing between what is not an ask, something that's intangible, and something that is an ask, something that's tangible. So if your ask isn't tangible, you are not doing advocacy. You've come all this way and you've stopped short. What you've done is you've raised awareness and you've educated the decision maker, and that's fine. You need to do those things. But you need to take the final step. If you want to do advocacy, you need to take the final step to say, now, as a result of what I've told you, I need you to do this tangible thing, this thing I can see and I can prove that it's been done. And that's what we call your one ask. So to build on what I said earlier, I can train people how to do this work. I can help develop strategies. I can even help people implement those strategies, but I cannot implement them as well as you can. Anybody who's directly affected by the issue. All of the people that I've been referencing today, politicians and bureaucrats who impact all of our lives, are public servants paid by our tax dollars. And you have, I'm going to suggest to you, every right to advocate to these people. When I say right, I don't just pick that word out of thin air. I'm talking about a right under Section 2 of the Charter, which talks about freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. If you didn't know, you have a constitutionally protected right to do what I've described to you today to government. In fact, in legal terms, we describe it as it attaches to you. You couldn't even get rid of it if you wanted to. It is a part of who you are as a Canadian. You have a right to do this. And then finally, let me just draw your attention to the last bullet on the slide. Government wins when you give up, so never give up. It's very easy to say. It is not very easy to do in many circumstances, but it is the truest thing on this slide. And I've mentioned this over and over again. You've got to just keep going if you want to affect the change. And just in conclusion, let me tell you that the biggest challenge I have doing this work in Canada, or that I've observed in doing this work in Canada, is that it's very un-Canadian to advocate for change. This is the land of peace, order, and good government, as you may recall. And those three words or terms are not a recipe for big change. Think about it. Peace, that doesn't really suggest change. Order, I mean, that really doesn't suggest change. And good government, whatever that even means. But surely it means something like, don't rock the boat. We, the decision makers, know what we're doing. Peace, order, and good government. It's the foundation of this country. And yet I just told you have a constitutionally protected right to do this. These concepts are diametrically opposed to one another in some way, but the constitutionally protected right trumps the foundation upon which this country was founded. My point being that oftentimes as Canadians, culturally, we default to the founding principles and we forget about the rights that we have, the right to be able to do this. And I ask you to always remember that you're allowed to do this, that you're protected to do this, and to make the change that you need. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ryan. So I'd just like to remind all attendees that there is a bit of time for some questions. So if you do have any questions for Ryan, now's the time. You can type any questions into the window on your right, and we'll address them as they arrive in. We do have a statement in the question box from Ann Newman where she just wanted to mention, and you said as well, it's very important to keep a positive and proactive approach when approaching government with healthcare experiences. And that's definitely, like you said, you touched on that as well. So it's a very good point. So thanks for that, Anne. We have another question that's how do you make the problems you advocate for get to the top of the pile when there's so much competition with other pressing issues?
There is a lot of competition, and I'm actually glad that you use that word, because it is a competition, and you have to think of it as a competition, quite frankly. The way you do that is really by following this formula, because most people don't know how to do this. They don't know that there is a kind of step-by-step process, as I've outlined. They don't know that there are these foundational pieces that I've outlined. And again, I've given you sort of a taste of this without drilling down deeply into each of these elements. But that's really the way you do it. It's by following these steps and doing it in a sustained manner. So there's constantly things going on, and also knowing when it is appropriate to really sort of turn up the volume. And some of the other pieces I mentioned around striking when the iron's hot, and recognizing some of these other issues and taking advantage of other public policy opportunities. But it is very much a competition, and it's relentlessness. It's sticking with it. It's not being aggressive or assertive. That's not what we're talking about. But it's just not giving up and sticking with it, and just constantly talking about it. So that basically, you want to sort of strike a very fine line between not being a pest or being annoying, but not being easily just kind of shoved off to the side or pushed to the side. You want to walk what is a very fine line where, and this is the people who do this the best, this is where they walk. Government recognizes that they have a value. They think of them, we're talking about stakeholders now, they think of them almost as partners, because they add value to their ability to govern. And if you can become one of those people, or sort of occupy that ground, then you have broken through. You've broken through just the complainers, or the people who sort of linger around but don't really do anything, and all of that kind of stuff. You become, I use the word partner, it's not the best word, but you become somebody, or you become an organization that government actually goes to, instead of waiting for you to come to them. Then you've broken through. So those are some pieces to being effective in that regard.
Fantastic, great answer, Ryan. Thanks for that question. We don't have any other questions at this time, so I'm going to end the webinar